You are listening to MG Sport Now. Today we are going to be going through a lot of receivers. This is going to be much more of a full guide than I did with the quarterbacks, because I feel like with the receivers there's less of an idea of exactly who the guys we should be looking at are. It's not as clear cut as quarterback, where the top 6 guys probably are the top 6 guys for the most part. But I will also come back around and have a look at those later round quarterbacks in another video. But today we're doing a deep dive of this receiver class. It is a bit controversial, particularly towards the high end, so feel free to disagree with whatever I have to say. But it's all based on what I'm seeing on film. I'll try not to ramble too much with the UDFA guys, the late round guys. I'll try to spend a bit more time on the top end. But if you're only really interested in the high end guys, then feel free to skip to that portion of the video. Okay, so the first group here, we've got the true UDFA prospects. Obviously, I don't want to be too harsh, but these aren't guys who I see anything in them that makes me think they're even worth much of a punt. I thought Bub Means had really good hands, but nothing in terms of route running and speed and things of that nature. Jamari Thrash, again, just didn't give me enough in terms of separation, and his hands actually weren't good at all. Jacob Cowing, 5'8", 168 pounds. That's obviously an issue, but if he showed me any type of dynamism, I would have put him in priority free agent, but unfortunately that just wasn't the case. And then the reason Hayden Hatton's at the top of this group, small school guy, couldn't find a ton of film on him. Definitely a contested catch threat, but everything I saw in terms of route running and separation just not up to par. So that's that group there. Effectively, I just need to see a little something in terms of what I can grab onto and say, okay, we'll pick them up in priority UDFA. Moving on to that group, priority UDFA, and there is a bit of a controversial name in here. Jalen Polk. I completely realise this is harsh, and in terms of production, he's probably outperformed a lot of the guys in front of him. I'm just basing this off what I can see. I'm looking directly at the prospect himself, not the production and the outcome, because that can be due, for example, with Washington. I think it's no surprise that Michael Penix had a great year, Roma Dunza had a great year, Polk had a great year. We are also going to talk about Jalen McMillan, who didn't have the production of Polk, but I'll explain why I've actually got him higher in the rankings. But this is clearly a very well set up team, offensively especially, and that can happen. Where, to me, Jalen Polk, he's schemed into space. Absolutely feel free to disagree with me, but show me the play that I'm missing here where he's just creating true separation for himself, and he's not just schemed into those positions. Michael Penix, I'm not a huge fan of, but with a clean pocket, he can deliver the ball where it needs to go, and you can see why Polk's picked up a bit of traction in his draft stock with the production he's creating. But to me, it just wasn't dynamic. He wasn't creating separation with route running and speed and things of that nature, and that's what I want from a receiver. I appreciate he's a great contested catch threat, and that might be what I'm missing, but to me you need a little bit more than that. You need to be able to create separation, and then if you can also bring the ball in at a high level, that's great. Just not for me. I hope he proves me wrong. And then Aniyah Smith out of Texas A&M, the reason I actually have him a notch above Polk is he's got great hands. He doesn't show that separation and speed and route running and things I like to see, again, like Polk, but he is a gifted punt returner, and I look at the way he's built. He's short, stocky, has a bit of juice, clearly with the ball in his hand, bench pressed more than anyone in the combine. I wonder if this is a sort of running back hybrid type of guy. That's the sort of thing with these priority UDFA guys. I just need a little something to grab onto. Okay, so moving on to our 7th round guys, and again we'll start with the sort of controversial figure in this category, which is Troy Franklin. Troy Franklin getting a lot of hype at the moment. He's actually some people's wide receiver 4. Obviously, that shows the fine lines of how different people can see a prospect in a slightly different light. And someone like me, I have him as wide receiver 33, and someone else thinks they're a borderline first rounder. And again, I'm truly watching these prospects for what they are, not their production. I don't think it's a surprise that these two slightly controversial guys are Polk and Franklin, who have 2 of the quarterbacks who are projected to go maybe first round, and if not first round, second round this year. So of course, if they're one of the preferable receivers in that core, they're going to have good production, good stats. But in terms of Franklin, he's very skinny. I hear talk about Xavier Worthy and his frame, which I have absolutely my doubts about, and we'll get to him. Franklin 6'2", 176, and the important part of that is the height. Because like I've said before in the quarterback video with Jaden Daniels, I actually have more concern when you're 6'2", 176 than a true slot guy who's 5'8" and carrying that type of mass, because Franklin really lacking meat on the bone, could easily see him getting hurt, and of course that's worth taking a punt on if he's really showing something, but has some really questionable hands, really struggles to bring the ball in. There's an element of his route running that I like. He's got a nice stutter, which gives me enough promise to have him here, where you do take a bit of a punt in the 7th round, but just not sudden enough for me when he's 176. You know, you're expecting a super explosive, sudden guy, and he didn't show any of that to me. We've spoken about the hands, and then when I looked at the combine numbers, it made a lot of sense to me. He ran a 4.41, which is, if he was to go in the 7th round, that's definitely higher than a lot of other guys who are going to go in the 7th round, but not overly impressive at that size. But then you look at the 10-yard split, and the 10-yard split to me is more important than the 40-yard, because that's the speed you're actually running at when you come out of your breaks. Troy Franklin runs a 1.61, which is slowest out of anyone at the combine, so that makes a lot of sense to me. In terms of the rest of the group, Ryan Flournoy, another one of these small school guys, seems to have a little bit of juice, which is why he's here, but in terms of route running polish, completely lacking, complete project in that area. But he's thick, fast, maybe he's got something. Devontae Walker, similar issue here. He is at a bigger school, he's at North Carolina. He tore his ACL coming out of high school and then got injured this season as well as missing the first 4 games due to transfer eligibility reasons. So he's a bit of a weird prospect in that sense, but very explosive, big, long arms, but it's very much straight line speed. Needs to pick up some route running nuance for sure if he's going to have a chance of making anything more than a practice squad in the league. Xavier Weaver, very lightweight, but actually I thought a very fluid and nuanced route runner, dangerous punt returner, but already had some injury issues, and at his weight that just too much of a red flag for me to take too early. Joshua Cephas out of UTSA, didn't get a combine invite, but very promising 10-yard split at the pro day. This said he's lanky, poor contested catch stats, does look like he could be pretty elusive, but hard to find too much evidence in terms of all 22, and didn't like the consistency in his hands, so that's why he's here. Then you've got Isaiah Williams, who by the way ran a 4.6 and also ran a faster 10-yard split than Troy Franklin. So I think that's interesting if you're wondering the difference between someone's long speed and their short speed. That's how big of a gap you can have. He's had 3 muffed punts in 2 seasons, which I think can be a bit of an issue if you're drafting this guy as a punt returner. Very elusive route runner, very elusive with the ball in his hand, but bringing it in through traffic is a bit of an issue, and that's why he's a bit lower down than he should be considering his route running ability. But short, stocky, good build for a slot guy. Now, Jaquan Jackson out of Tulane's interesting, but it's a similar story. Compact, quick, looks like he could develop into a talented slot option, but dealt with knee injury in the past, and bringing the ball in is a bit of an issue. So you're seeing the theme with these 7th round guys. A lot of them are potential slot options, but a big part of that role is bringing the ball in through traffic. So moving on to the 6th rounders, and again we'll get straight to the controversial name here. I think this is probably the last particularly controversial name being particularly low, but you'll notice we've got 38 receivers here who I'm talking about being drafted, so it's a strong class. Xavier Worthy, obviously super explosive, as seen by the fastest 40-yard dash time ever. The caveat to that, of course, in terms of what he is as a prospect, is he ran that time at 165 pounds, 5'11". That's a very, very frail size to be in the league. And by the way, of course, it's an unbelievable time. The 10-yard split was 1.49, which is joint with Anthony Gold in this class. And it was only 0.01 of a second faster than Brian Thomas. So not to say that's not very explosive, but it's not quite as freakishly quick. When you talk about the 10-yard split, there's plenty of guys through history who have run a much faster 10-yard split than Worthy. And so again, I'm certainly not saying he's slow, but I think that's worth mentioning. And my issue here is I just can't find a role for him. When you talk about it as fans, you think, well, of course you take him in the 2nd or 3rd round just because he's so quick and the upside's so high. But when you're a GM, I don't think you're going to see it that way, because every pick means so much, and you're not just going to take a guy with no plan for what he's actually going to be. So is he going to be a slot guy because he's a bit smaller? Well, bringing the ball in through traffic, he really struggled in college. So you condense that in the NFL, he's got no chance of doing that. So that's going to be a real issue. But then you put him on the outside, and any corner who can get their hands on him, which they'll be able to on the outside because you're not working with so much space as you are in the slot. He's obviously completely disrupted because he's £165. I mean, that's tiny. Not to mention, obviously, injury risks at that size, goes without saying. So I appreciate why people think he's worth a swing in much earlier rounds than I'm talking about here, but just not for me. In terms of some of these other guys, Casey Washington out of Illinois at 31, I've seen him listed at 6'2". He looks a lot smaller to me than that. Very silky route runner, but I very much question whether he's going to be able to extend that cushion enough in the NFL because he looks very slow to me. Malachi Corley at 30, I suppose, is a bit of a controversial one because he's had some hype in terms of people thinking he could be that Deebo Samuel type, take him in the second or third round, and if you utilise him, he can be a sort of hybrid-y type of guy. But I think what people forget is that Deebo Samuel only works in the Shanahan system, and he was a much better prospect than Corley himself. Physically, he stood above Corley and route running and things of that nature, and in terms of the running back thing, he showed more promise in those areas than Corley has coming out of college. And even so, when you watch Deebo Samuel as a receiver, he's actually not gaining very much separation in his routes. I've watched him on the All-22 before, and I feel like people lose sight of the fact that he's a weapon, but it's a very specific role, and to say that Corley's just going to become that on any team he ends up on isn't realistic, and he's got very questionable hands. Speaking about Corley now himself, smooth route runner, a little bit like Deebo Samuel, but not elusive and not gaining any real separation, but he's thick, great contact balance. He has got a little bit of that thing that people talk about when they talk about that hybrid-y running back, perimeter running back type of role. So that's why he's not UDFA, obviously, because I can see a team taking a bit of a swing on him and seeing if they can carve out any sort of role that fits him specifically. Jordan Whittington I really liked, out of Texas, obviously sharing the production with Adonai Mitchell, Xavier Worthy and Jatavion Sanders, so you can appreciate that his stats may be a little bit less than he may deserve, but does a lot of the dirty work, tough blocker, very nuanced route runner, but also a bit clunky and slow, and I don't know if he's going to gain enough separation in the league. I think he has contested catch potential with that frame, obviously, but he's not proven that to me quite yet. So I see potential here. I see a little bit of Keenan Allen, but obviously he's not there as a prospect just yet. Cornelius Johnson out of Michigan, very rigid running style. Certainly doesn't look like a natural runner to me, but that doesn't always matter. He plays physical, he's an effective blocker like Whittington, and he does struggle to gain separation in the same way that Whittington does. He's a bit of a bigger guy, not so fluid, but very nuanced release package and very good catching through traffic, which is what gave him the edge to me over Whittington. So I can see you taking this guy in the 6th round and suddenly week 1, who's this guy in the slot, picking up some production straight away. Still a bit of a projection, obviously. Okay, so moving on to 5th rounders. These tiers, by the way, they're obviously a bit rough. I haven't looked at the whole class. It's impossible for me to know exactly where these guys should go without looking at the other positions, but these are sort of the rough tiers that I put them into, and I think it makes sense in terms of gauging a rough idea of where they should go. So 5th rounders. And I suppose this is the start of guys who I think, okay, we've actually got something here that I'm interested in, and I think these are some guys who you look back on and think, well, how was this guy taken in the 5th round and he's receiving for 800 yards a season? Obviously, that's just upside. It's a bit of a projection, but that's the group of guys we're talking about here. Devon Vele. I think this guy's going under the radar a little bit at the moment because production was never anything particularly impressive in college, but I think he has some potential in the NFL as a big slot. 6'4" and a fluid route runner. Obviously, as you can imagine, bigger guy going in the 5th round, he's not creating crazy separation with speed or anything like that, but he's not massively slow and he can gain a little bit of a cushion with his route running, and at that size, if he can improve his hands, because at the moment they're not as impressive as I'd hope for someone of his size in terms of contested catch numbers, but I see potential here if he can improve that. Tavion Robinson out of Kentucky. This guy was a bit of a frustrating watch, in all honesty, because very impressive route runner. Really like the look of him. He's 5'10", 190, so good size for a sort of slot guy in the league. And again, I really like his movement and I see potential here, but some really disappointing focus drops on tape. The sort of drops where you go, me or you quite literally would have caught that, and that's obviously not going to hold up in the NFL. But again, it might just be a tweak in mindset, a bit more focus, and suddenly you've got someone who can give you some real production. Anthony Gold. We mentioned him earlier when we spoke about Worthy. Anthony Gold had a 10-yard split as fast as Xavier Worthy. And I hate to draw too much attention to this because I'm sure people will be critical of that, but I've got him obviously a tier above Xavier Worthy. Anthony Gold coming out of Oregon State. He is 5'8", 174 pounds. It's a much thicker build than someone like Worthy. He ran a 4.39, but again, makes sense that on film, he actually looks a little bit faster than that. He looks very explosive, which speaks to the 10-yard split. He's got a great feel for space with the ball in his hand, which has made him a gifted punt returner in college. Now, unfortunately, his yak numbers weren't as good as I was hoping, but the way he moves with the ball in his hand, I think there is some yak potential here, more than showed in college. And when a guy moves like that, you think there is real slot potential here. And just to clarify, I think with a much thicker build than Worthy, he has a lot more potential when it comes to catching through traffic. Drake Stoops, Oklahoma. This guy seems to have gone completely under the radar, didn't get a combine invite, but very fluid and nuanced route runner. He's going to be a slot guy like a lot of these prospects we're talking about in this area, but definitely can get open. And I regret that I couldn't have him a bit higher as it happens, but that's the sort of class that we're talking about. 17 missed tackles forced, so dangerous with the ball in his hand as well. However, he did run a very slow 40 time at his pro day. 4.67 for a guy who's a bit on the lighter side anyway. That's obviously very underwhelming, but we know that for a slot receiver, that 40 time can be very misleading and doesn't always make much of a difference in those short areas that you're operating in when you're playing as a slot receiver. Excellent catching through traffic, which is very impressive for a guy who unfortunately does have some play strength issues, and that's why I couldn't put him that little bit higher. Does get pushed around a little bit at times, and you would think that exaggerates when he gets to the league. Lydiatric Tulu Griffin out of Mississippi State. 5'10", 180 pounds, built for the slot, and I thought a very nifty, nuanced route runner. I don't know what happened in the combine drills, but he was definitely underwhelming there. Ran a 4.43 40-yard dash, which is fine, but 7-second 3-cone drill, 4.35 20-yard shuttle. Those are very important to me for a slot guy who's going to be running those more nifty short routes that require more short area quickness, curl routes, things of that nature. But again, what I see on film is more important to me than the drills, because some guys just don't practice these drills as much as others, and if he's doing it on film, then I've not got too much issue with it. He has great yak, has played a bit of running back, and I think if you're going to talk about a hybrid type of guy like a Malachi Corley, this guy should be just as much in consideration for that, as well as, to me, having much more of a chance as a pure receiver at the same time with his route running. Now, he does have very questionable hands, and that's something that really needs to improve if he is going to be that guy who finds a serious role when he gets into the league. Taj Washington out of USC, 174 pounds, but 5'10", pretty compact. I worry about his health a little bit, but it's not super frail. Has some special teams value as a returner and as a gunner. 18 missed tackles forced in the year, very promising yak. He's highly elusive with the ball in his hands, but he's also tough, especially for his size. That's important, that he doesn't shy away from contact. He wants to get every yard. So I don't think you're going to make this guy a running back by any means at his size, but could have a bit of a hybrid role. And a very fluid route runner, excellent hands, tough blocker. This guy could have a role if he can stay healthy. And David White Jr. out of Western Carolina, obviously a small school guy, so it is tough to find film on him, information on him. He missed some games in the year, and there isn't even very much information about why he missed the games, whether it was due to injury, because college can be a bit like that, and especially the smaller school guys, it's hard to find out information, but seemed healthy after his injury, was moving fine, and from what I saw, showed a lot of promise in terms of his release package, outrunning. He's big, he's long, speed is a big question mark, but he could be Devontae Adams-ish in that way, I guess, but probably a bit more of a contested catch threat guy in that sense, but just it's so much projection when I'm struggling to find real legitimate film on him. Fourth rounders then, and these first two guys are still slot options, but if I had to guess, these guys are going to have a legitimate role in the league as a slot option. They still have a couple of question marks, which is why they're not second, third round type of guys, but we're getting to the real deal guys here. Starting with Malik Washington out of Virginia. I believe this is Taj Washington, who we've already spoken about. I believe this is his brother. Let me know if I'm wrong. But Malik Washington, 5'8", 190 pounds. So very thick, strong build. Had 19 reps in the bench press at the combine, which is joint second to Anais Smith, who was on 21. And Washington's just super tough and smooth with the ball in his hands. Very hard to bring down. This is probably going to be another guy that you can definitely utilise with the ball in his hands, maybe as a running back, but even if it's just slant routes, getting the ball in his hands and seeing what happens. He's a gifted punt returner. 35 missed tackles forced on the year is astronomical. And he flashes very, very smooth and nuanced route running, very reliable, bringing the ball in through traffic. So you'll notice that for me in the slot, the guys who I think succeed are the guys who can create that little bit of cushion, but also be able to bring it in through traffic if you are a pure slot guy. So yeah, I think he's got a real chance. As does Luke McCaffrey, brother of course of Christian McCaffrey, and he's been a receiver for just 2 years after being a quarterback. So anything this guy needs to work on and grow on, you think, well, he's only been playing for 2 years. I'm sure he has all the capacity to work on these things, considering he's gotten to the level he has in just 2 years. And this isn't a complete project. He's thick, he's agile, great hands, very reliable hands. He had the fastest 20-yard shuttle at the combine and the second fastest 3-cone drill, which I need to see it on tape as well, which I did, but also it makes a lot of sense to me that you see these types of drills he excels at when you get a guy who runs routes at the level he does. And maybe I was a little bit of a coward with the Luke McCaffrey because I just couldn't quite gauge exactly how good he can be in the league against such low competition, coming out of Rice, by the way. I'm not sure I mentioned, but he's got it all. He's got everything it takes to be a legitimate high-level slot receiver, but just a little bit difficult to tell for sure when he's playing at such a low level. And now these other two in the 4th round category, I think probably have about as much chance to succeed in the league as the 5th round guys, but maybe even as a number 2 on the outside, as a true upside. Brendan Rice, out of USC, son of Jerry Rice. Very choppy, angry route runner, so it looks a little bit rigid, but he gets open. Some of these guys fool you with their running style not being particularly fluid, but that doesn't mean ability to shift, change direction, stop on a dime, etc. It doesn't mean he can't do that at a high level in his own way. It just might not be quite as fluid. 33-inch arms, that's great. Big frame, and clearly has potential in contested catch situations. There were quite a few that I wish he would have brought down this year, which he didn't, so it's a bit of a question mark, but he clearly has the potential to do it. And yeah, like I say, has the upside of a reliable guy who can play on the outside. As does a guy who I think I'm particularly high on, Marcus Rosemary Jack Saint out of Georgia. Has missed some time due to injury, as well as not exactly elite quarterback play from what I can see, hence the low production, but he's obviously big, only needs a small cushion to bring it in through traffic, and he gains a bit of a cushion with very high level route running. I'm a huge fan of his release package. Definitely has the potential to be that sort of Keenan Allen type of guy, where he's not going to blow you away with speed or even separation from route running, but gains that edge, and he's just a reliable target that can be a consistent number 2. As you've seen with Keenan Allen later in his career, he's even been a number 1 at this stage in his career, and personally, I don't agree with that. I think people don't realise how much of that is Justin Herbert being a lot better than people can fathom, but that's besides the point. Okay, so moving on to 3rd rounders, starting with Johnny Wilson out of Florida State. And I think people were a little bit scared to project what this guy is because we've not seen something like it before, but he's 6'6", 230 pounds, 35.5-inch arms, and displays shocking fluidity in a good way for how big he is. Very, very fluid route runner. So that's huge upside. If you want to picture what he might be in the league as a receiver, well, you think of these tight ends, you think of Kittle and Kelsey and people like that who, when a guy's that big and can move that well, it's pretty self-explanatory that there's not much these 6-foot DBs can do. So there's huge upside here, and that's why I've got him as high as I do. But at the same time, the reason I've got him as low as I do is that his ability to bring the ball in is very disappointing for a guy of his size. He's not the prototype that I thought he would be. He's not going up and getting it on a consistent basis. He has some very disappointing drops, focus drops, and his hands do look weak, which is obviously a huge question mark. But for the amount of legitimate potential I think he has, I couldn't have him any lower. Then you've got Jalen McMillan out of Washington, who is a bit of an outlier, being that he's a pure slot option, who I'm projecting to be good enough to go in the third round for me, purely as a slot guy. And we spoke about him earlier. This is a little bit controversial purely because I have him considerably higher than his teammate Jalen Polk, who had a lot more production last season. Now that's not massively fair because McMillan's missed a ton of games due to injury, and I also think he's far more suited to the league as a slot guy, whereas Jalen Polk I think was taking advantage of traits that suit college much more than the true nuance you need to your game when you're playing in the league. McMillan's thick, 6'1", 197 pounds, and I guess I am particularly high on this guy compared to other people, but I don't know what other people aren't seeing in terms of how consistent of a target he's going to be in the league. Okay, he's not got that upside, he's very much going to be a slot guy, but he's very impressive route runner, very nuanced, very fluid. My favourite part of his game is the release package, gets that instant inch on the defender. And my only slight concern is that the hands aren't as impressive as I'd like them to be, but I was so floored by his route running ability. I think his hands would have to be particularly bad for him to not be a consistent option in the league. Moving on to teammate of Johnny Wilson, Keon Coleman, coming out of Florida State, who started the season as a very much consensus wide receiver 4 in that category of Adunze, Neighbours and Harrison. And at the time, I was very much against that. I didn't see that at all. But this is just what I was seeing on the broadcast. And when I watched it on film, again, it may not seem like it because I've got him as wide receiver 13 due to this class being deep, but I saw some real potential here. Missed some games due to injury, but if he can stay healthy, this is clearly a guy who has the size and the ability to go up and get the ball, plays very physical, and I saw some very elusive route running ability, which I was very surprised by. Clearly not running away from guys, hence the 4.61 combine 40, but as a bigger number 2 target, which is the sort of upside that we're talking about with these guys, you don't necessarily need to be blowing guys away with separation. He can just get that inch, and if he can consistently bring the ball in, that'll be enough. And he shows a lot more of those traits than I was expecting to see. Jalen Coker coming out of Holy Cross, and it's pretty clear to see why he's not necessarily on the radar for everyone. Very much small school receiver, dominated against his competition, but it's impossible to know for sure if he can make that step up. But from the footage I could find, I saw enough evidence of super high upside. I mean, some of the best route running that I've seen in this entire class for a guy of his size as well. Goes up and gets it, huge contested catch threat, but again, very nuanced, fluid, silky route runner, no wasted steps. He ran a 4.57 at the combine, which obviously doesn't blow you out of the water, and people are kind of brushing him to the side, being that he's from a small school, bad 40 time, just completely disregard him. And I understand why that happens, but I've seen enough to know that this guy's worth taking a swing on. He also had the best vertical jump out of everyone at the combine, just in terms of receivers that is, which makes a lot of sense when you see his ability on tape to go up and get the ball. At 11 I've got Xavier Leggett, who in a similar vein is a little bit of an upside guy, but I see enough obviously to take him in the third round. He's very impressive when it comes to going up and getting the ball. Rattler would often just chuck it up for him and expect him to go and get it, and a lot of the time he did. He's 6'1", 220 pounds, so very stocky, but also has legit speed. He plays physical, he's a fluid route runner. In terms of not having him that little bit higher, I worry that he is a bit of a physicality guy. He doesn't show super nuanced route running, it's fluid, but it's not super elusive. He wins with physicality a lot of the time, but has some upside, and I think you take him in the third, hoping that he'll be your number 2 pretty quickly. As we move on to Ricky Pearsall out of Florida, another one of these true slot guys, although he's 6'1", 189, so that's pretty big for a slot guy, and uses that size well to bring the ball in. He's got great hands. He had one of the better catches you will have seen all year from anyone in college football. He's going to be a very consistent target in the league, and obviously he's low because he is a pure slot guy to me, because he's lacking that true explosiveness shown by the 1.57 10-yard split. Again, I don't want to use that as true evidence, but that's what I saw on film as well. But very polished route runner, has that nice sort of shift, gear change on the short to intermediate routes you want to see from the slot guy. So now we move into the guys who I think should be second rounders, and there is a controversial name here, and full transparency, this is a bit of a very controversial ranking when you look at who my number 1 is. It's not for shock value, hence why I've not tried to draw people in with the wide receiver 1 I have in the title. That's not why I'm doing this, but this is what I see, and it surprises me every year when people think the first rounders are bound for success. When you look at the success rate of these first round guys in all positions, the production can be completely misleading in every position, and we'll get to Rome Odunze and I'll explain where I'm at with him. But these are true second rounders to me, for clarity. I've got a tier after this of guys who I think are brink of first round, early second round. These guys are true second rounders. Starting with Roman Wilson out of Michigan, who looks like a pure slot guy in that he's 5'11", 185 pounds, and he may well do a lot of his best work out of the slot, but that's only because he needs the space to operate without his play strength becoming an issue. It's not because he doesn't have the explosiveness to stretch the field. So it's a different sort of guy, if you know what I mean, to a Julian Edelman. Now, he's not going to bring the ball in through contact, he's not going to be that guy, but consistent enough hands and very, very twitchy, and shows real potential as a route runner, although I think that area does need to develop if he's going to take that next step. But he's going to get open, and his hands are very, very reliable. It's only due to size that he's not bringing it in through contact, but he's got practically no drops on his tape that aren't warranted. So I think this guy's going to be a reliable number 2 with the upside of having a real impact, borderline number 1 maybe on a team that doesn't have that superstar. That's the upside to me, but most likely just a very reliable number 2, and you'll take that in a second. I actually don't like him nearly as much as number 8 on this list, Javon Baker, who I guess is going under the radar because 4.54 at the combine, 1.58 10-yard split. These are disappointing numbers, but when you watch the tape, he's clearly twitchy. Sometimes that short area quickness doesn't translate to straight line speed in the combine, but he can clearly do it. He's clearly a very elusive, fluid route runner, although he was not utilised so much in that area as he ran a very simple route tree, but he shows clear ability to me in that area. He's 6'1", 200 pounds, so he's thick. He brings the ball in through contact. I project this guy to be a serious number 2, if not with the upside of a 1 in the future. I don't know what he's missing to where people don't see that upside. Again, tell me why I'm wrong, but don't just tell me, oh, his 40 time is slow and things that aren't what you're actually seeing on film, because we know that that can be misleading. We've seen Davante Adams go in the second, Justin Jefferson go in the second. I haven't gone through NFL receivers on film since last season, but last time I checked, those were the 2 best receivers in the game. But they didn't blow people away with their combine numbers, so we just disregard them as first round talent. And maybe I'm doing that with Baker because he's a second rounder to me due to the fact that I didn't see enough nuanced route running, but I see clear potential in that area and he does everything well. So bear in mind that I do really like the guy that I've got directly behind Rome Odunze out of Washington. Now, I think Odunze is going to be a consistent number 2 in the league. I'm not saying that he's going to be a bad receiver, but someone needs to show me why he's going to be an elite 1 that you take in the top 10 of the draft without just talking about his production in college, because to me he's a product of that Washington passing scheme that was very impressive and I think elevated a few different guys in that offense. I think Mike Penix is becoming a bit overrated for me. I think Jalen Polk's becoming a bit overrated, and I think now we're talking about Rome Odunze, who I think is a bit overrated, and if it translates, it translates. These aren't reasons for why I don't like them as prospects, but if you're wondering, these are reasons why I think maybe other people have got the wrong impression of these guys. Odunze is not going to be a true separator in the league. He's a smooth route runner, he's got a bit of speed, a bit of burst, but he's not super fluid, elusive to where he's going to be open all the time. He's going to be a bit of a contested catch guy, a consistent target for his quarterback, where if the first guy's not open, number 2, Odunze's reliable, brings the ball in well. But I'm interested to hear where the difference in opinion is here, because either people think he's more of a separator than I do, which I'd love to see examples of because I'm not seeing it, or you're projecting a guy who's far more orientated to contested catch opportunities than actually getting open to be a top 10 receiver in the league. You look at Justin Jefferson, Davante Adams, Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs. These guys are all elusive. They get open. They don't just go up and get it. People may think that's AJ Brown, but AJ Brown is a freak of nature, similar to DK Metcalf. These guys are consistent bringing the ball in, but they're also getting open. They're also too physical for the opposition and too quick. It's not because you can just chuck it to them when they're not gaining separation and they'll just go up and get it. there's no true example of the Roma Dunze prototype that has worked at a very high level in the league. At least in today's game, it's a different game. It's not as physical as it used to be. I appreciate that there probably was a time where you could have a guy who just goes up and gets it because you can out-physical people. Now with the penalties and the rules on how physical you can be with the DB, you need some real nuance and separation to give yourself a chance, and I'm not seeing that with Dunze. I think he's schemed into space a lot of the time, and I think the go up and get it type of receiver works a bit more in college than it does in the league because it's men against boys a little bit. So again, I have to sound like a bit of a hater because I happen to be lower than other people on Dunze, but he's still my receiver 7 in what I think is a very good class, so I resent the fact that I have to be so negative about him. At 6, I've got what I would call the most difficult evaluation of the whole class because there's a huge part of it that I have no access to. Jermaine Burton out of Alabama. And unfortunately, the biggest question with him isn't on the field. He has some real question marks with character. In 2022, he struck a woman, a fan, a Tennessee fan. I don't know the ins and outs of why he did it, but clearly very much the wrong thing to be doing, and probably not a guy you want in your locker room. But in terms of how much difference it will make in the long run, I think people need to remember that there's a lot of these guys in the league who have done bad things, and if you play well enough, people forget it. I'm certainly not saying that's right, but that's often the way it is, unfortunately. And without delving into a whole different situation, if you remember, Tyreek Hill had some real question marks. He had some pretty dodgy accusations made about him, and seemingly people have completely forgotten because he's doing what he's doing. So rightly or wrongly, that's the way it can work sometimes. And as a player, I think Jermaine Burton has all the ability to be a very high-end 2, and I think he can even be a low-end 1. I haven't heard much buzz about him, maybe because of his situation, but this whole thing about him being a pure deep threat, I think is completely inaccurate. Just because he was used in that way doesn't necessarily mean that that's his main skill. He's very explosive, which is why Bama used him in that way, but I've seen a lot of very silky, elusive route running from him. He plays physical, he knows how to vary his speed, got very reliable hands, excellent ball tracking. I think this will come down to character, but on field he's got it all to be a borderline number 1, like I've said. Moving into our next category, where I've only got a couple of guys, but I wanted to make this its own tier because I think they are in their own tier. I think this is sort of, if you take them in the top 10, I think that's a huge reach, but if you need a receiver and you're sat there in the 20s, I understand going for one of these guys. So they're sort of late first rounder, early second rounders to me. Starting with Brian Thomas Jr. He's big, he's fast, he's got all the traits, and I guess this tier is kind of high-end wide receiver 2 to me, with the upside of being a 1. But the reason he's not guaranteed 1 is because he's not the most elusive route runner in the world, which I appreciate. Some people think he's just going to blow past everyone with speed and size, but to me that's not the case. I think when it comes to the NFL, you need just a touch more nuance than he has to get open as consistently as number 1 receiver does. But he's just dangerous. He's DK Metcalf-ish for sure. Brings the ball in well through contact, as you'd expect with his frame. And I will say, with DK Metcalf being his upside, Metcalf isn't a top 10 receiver in the league. I think he's a lower end 1. So if that's the upside for Brian Thomas, you struggle to convince yourself that that's a guy worth taking in the sort of top 10 region of the draft, especially considering there's so much talent in this class and it doesn't seem like a one-off. We're seeing more and more receivers coming out of college and being able to find production. So the value of a high-end receiver is dropping as well. In number 4, I've got Adonai Mitchell, and it's a similar sort of thing like Brian Thomas Jr. All the physical traits there. He's big, he's fast, definitely faster than I anticipated on the broadcast, and he's a much more advanced route runner than I was expecting. That was what was particularly intriguing to me and why he's above Brian Thomas Jr., because I think he's actually a better route runner than Brian Thomas. So Mitchell is one where I think the upside is like legitimately elite NFL receiver. The reason he's in this tier and not the tier above, he's just not shown me quite enough in the way of true separation. And I know that sounds contradictory because he's got the speed, he's got the route running, so what doesn't he have? Well, the truth is the guys in the category above him are in their own tier for a reason. They are the elite of the elite, and to be on that level, the route running, the separation you create from fluidity and nuanced route running needs to be best of the best. But Mitchell's going to be a high-end number 2 at the worst, in my opinion. So moving into maybe the most controversial sports opinion I've ever had, But again, it's not for effect. This is just what I see. I'm always going to tell you exactly what I see, regardless of the backlash I may receive, because I'm confident enough to trust what I'm seeing. And all three of these players are number one receivers in the league. To me, that's why they're in their own tier. They're the type of guys you take in the top 10 of the draft, maybe even top 5 of the draft. And I think you'll agree with me apart from one. So we'll get into all of these guys, starting with Marvin Harrison Jr. at 3. And this is the sort of prototype that I like in Marvin Harrison. Consensus number 1 for a long time in almost everyone's board. I'm seeing a bit of movement now. You're seeing Malik Neighbors rise a little bit. You're seeing a few people say that maybe Malik Neighbors is wide receiver 1 now. But clearly, Marvin Harrison, maybe the highest floor of all of these guys. Very, very polished, high-level route running nuance, and excellent fluidity in his routes as well. Big frame, 6'3", carrying a good amount of mass. Had some drops, but generally consistent hands, catching through traffic, things of that nature. My only question is, do I think Marvin Harrison's going to be Davante Adams? No. And it's a very fine line, but he just doesn't quite display the truly elite one-of-one fluidity that someone like Davante Adams does in his routes. Now, why do I need him to be Davante Adams? Because he hasn't got the explosion to be a Jamar Chase and AJ Brown. That's not who he's going to be. He also isn't displaying super high-level contested catch ability, so that's not what he's going to be. And I appreciate he's going to win with route running, nuance and fluidity, and we know he's got it, but I have to make clear what the difference is from him being 3 and him being 1. It's just a touch clunkier than the truly elite top 10 type of receivers in the league, but a very safe pick. You're getting a number 1. I think you're probably getting a top 20-ish guy in the league. I'm not sure you're quite getting a top 10 type of guy, but I wouldn't rule it out. It's tough to differentiate between these 3 guys. Now, Malik Neighbors, in terms of him over Marvin Harrison, this actually isn't to do with reasons I think other people have Malik Neighbors above Marvin Harrison, where they worry more about a deep threat, whereas I just want someone who's going to get open. I think Malik Neighbors will be open a little bit more than Marvin Harrison. I just think his speed, fluidity, twitch, it's obviously on another level to Marvin Harrison, and try stopping it. It's all well and good saying he's not super nuanced route runner, but he's got plenty of fluidity to make me think he's going to be able to run advanced enough routes to where he's making the most out of his speed. Hands are consistent. He's not super lightweight. He's 6 foot, 200 pounds. This guy's the real deal. Now, just in terms of why he's not number 1, I can see a world in which Neighbors isn't open every single play, because as much as the route running is enough, he's not super nuanced in that area. He is going to win with speed for the most part, and if a DB can somewhat stay on top of him, I don't know if he's going to have the nuance to pick that DB apart, but obviously the type of DB who can run with a guy like Malik Neighbors is super rare in itself, so nitpicking for sure. But that leads me to my wide receiver 1, Ladd McConkey. Obviously, who doesn't have Ladd McConkey as their wide receiver 1? It's pretty clear to see why McConkey isn't getting the type of attention that I'm suggesting he should be getting. He missed such a large proportion of games this season, so he's only got 483 receiving yards to his name in 2023. And obviously it's not elite quarterback play, but Marvin Harrison doesn't have that either, so that's not completely an excuse. But let me say this, just to try and get you on board before I actually break McConkey down here. If McConkey had the same amount of receiving snaps as Rome Odunze, he projects to have gone for 1,900 yards, 300 more than Odunze. So obviously to some extent that's a small sample size, but just to be clear, the amount of production he was putting forward last season when he played, if he did play the full season and that same amount of production continued, this guy would have had crazy production, and maybe everyone would be seeing him the way I'm seeing him. One of my favourite receivers in the entire league is Garrett Wilson. I think Garrett Wilson is criminally underrated, and Ladd McConkey to me is about as close to Garrett Wilson as you're going to get in a prospect, and Garrett Wilson very much is my comparison. To me they're very similar. If you think Ladd McConkey's a pure slot guy because he's too light or he's not fast enough or whatever, he weighs in at 3 pounds heavier than Garrett Wilson coming out. He ran a 4.39, Garrett Wilson ran a 4.38, and Garrett Wilson has no issue getting open play after play. It's a shame that he doesn't have the QB performance to highlight that all the time, but I promise you it's happening, and I promise you McConkey's very reminiscent. McConkey is hands down the best route runner in this class. And if someone wants to dispute that, show me the evidence. Show me that you've watched Lad McConkey run routes, and show me the routes that anyone else in this class is running at a higher level than him. Whether it's nuance, fluidity, anything to do with route running, McConkey is elite, and he's pretty explosive. He can run past you if you're not careful. So it's not like you can just sit on him and push him around and physically outmatch him. He's going to be physically fine in the NFL and one of the best route runners in the entire league, without doubt. It's so fluid, it's so dynamic, and that continues with the ball in his hand as well. He's got some serious yak threat. He's very elusive with the ball in his hand. Going back to this projection thing, if he played the same amount of snaps as Neighbours, he projects to have had 26 missed tackles forced, which would have been third in this entire class, other than Malik Neighbours himself and Malik Washington, who we've spoken about. Now, the reason his production wasn't what I think it would have been is because he got injured. He missed the first portion of the season due to back injury, and of course that sounds concerning. But then he comes back and looks like the most fluid route runner in this entire class. I struggle to think you're doing that if you've got a niggling back injury. I truly think he recovered from that, and it's not going to be an ongoing thing. This said, he's not carrying a ton of mass like a Marvin Harrison or even a Malik Neighbours. So in the same way that you have that slight concern with Devontae Smith, Garrett Wilson, Jalen Waddle, you really hope that he does stay healthy. But there's a reason these guys are working out, and they're not all getting injured. The rules are different to the way they used to be. These guys aren't getting roughed up all the time. You can survive at 185 pounds, and if this guy does stay healthy and he goes into a somewhat functional situation, he doesn't go into a situation where he's got 3 different quarterbacks throwing in the ball throughout the season and there's a couple of other gifted receivers who are stealing some of the production, he is going to stand out, and everyone is going to act like we couldn't have seen this coming. Lad McConkey is the real deal. You heard it here first. So here is your top 10, and I wouldn't be surprised if 9 out of these 10 are at worst 2s in the league. It's a very deep class, and to me, this is the pick of the bunch. Interestingly, with it being such a deep class, I've been quite picky with who I say is going to be going in the first round, because you know you can get that talent in the second round. So don't reach. The guys who I think you go, this is elite talent in the league, to where you don't want to just settle for the next best guy, are the top 3 that we've just spoken about. And then I think it should be Adonai Mitchell and Brian Thomas fighting to break into that first round conversation. To be clear, these tiers are based completely on what I think should be going on. I appreciate that Rome Odunze is probably going to be a top 10 draft pick, and I think he'll be good. So this is just what I'm seeing on the film. And here are your sleepers. I'm not going to give you a huge list of names as my sleepers, because what's the point in that? These are the guys to look out for. Lad McConkey, Jermaine Burton, Javon Baker, Jalen Coker. These are the guys who I think have got a real chance of reaching levels that very few people saw possible. Let me know your thoughts on this class. Let me know what you agree or disagree with, and I'll see you next time with cornerbacks.